are you all?
What we wanted to talk about is the idea of age verification. And I think maybe we want to start for folks who are maybe not as familiar with Australia and what's been going on, sort of in terms of regulatory innovation around this. So maybe you want to give a little bit of history about Australia and age verification, what's going on.
There was a book that came out called The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. And that was actually really the kind of nebulous of where a lot of age verification came in around social media. So what Jonathan Haidt's proposal was in his book is that there is a really impactful line in terms of child mental health with the introduction of social media. So 2012, there's this hard line. After that point, there's significant increases in suicidal ideation. I've got some things here. Self-poisonings of 10 to 12-year-olds quadrupled. Hospital admissions for self-harm tripled between 10 to 14-year-old girls. Major depressive episodes, 12 to 17-year-old girls increased 52% in just this really short period of time. And so a lot of the argument around Jonathan Haidt's book is we have introduced this unknown entity which is having severe and significant mental health impact on people during the most formative years of their brain development. And it's a very compelling story. There is pushback against it, obviously. There's a lot of conversations regarding correlation, causation, relationships as part of that, whether or not the research was really robust. And I've kind of delved into that a lot as well.
But something I want to say about that, because I think there is critique of the anxious generation in the book, but what we're seeing with a lot of kind of the discovery that happened with the cases against Facebook in LA and New Mexico is that Facebook's or Meta's internal documents showed that they knew that their products were having negative mental health effects on children and that they ignored their own ethicists in pursuit of growth. And so I think even, I've seen the critiques and I think some of them are founded that there's reasonable skepticism about some of the evidence used in the book. But I think the idea that social media has been a net negative for young people's mental health, I think that is a quite robust set of knowledge because we're seeing that the commercial entities themselves knew about it.
The commercial entities, but then there's also and I know this is, but anecdotal evidence. As adults, we know there is a mental impact to ourselves with fully formed brains being critiqued for how we looked, like the increase in anorexia, the increase in body dysmorphia. I don't think there is an argument from anyone that social media has introduced a new set of problems for children and how they access self-worth or self-identification through that process. I think that's pretty standard in terms of the conversation. The book and the critique around Jonathan Haidt, I feel, is a bit of a red herring. There may be sort of nuances in terms of the methodologies, but as I said, realistically, we know there's issues. I think that that's pretty standard, and most people inside the anti-social media ban, pro-privacy area are like, well, it's just up to the parents to manage. They just need to be able to manage libertarian values. People can choose what they want for them and their families. So that's how it goes rather than it being something that's legislated. However, I just can't dismiss that the impact is societal. If people have access to these tools, that there is then an additional social pressure of how they integrate inside the not only digital sphere, but this is how teenagers socialize. So it's completely changing their relationship to each other as part of that and how they form relationships with each other. So take that all as a bit of a bunch of information regarding the foundation. So it started with South Australia. I think his name's Peter Mantzoukas, was the premier. He'd read Anxious Generation and was the owner, put in a social media ban for South Australia, started to gain traction. That was implemented. Obviously, E-Safety Commission also was driving this adoption. And since it has launched, we have seen multiple countries around the world adopting similar proposals as part of their legislation. We've seen, I think it's Spain, many Scandinavian countries have been proposing this. We've got New Zealand. There is a real drive for this kind of disruption. If Meta or TikTok or any of these companies actually just changed their mechanisms, how they measured their own success, moved it away from attention, that would actually significantly change the dynamics inside these tools. But obviously that's how they monetize. And so they're unwilling to change those things. But we do know that an attention economy is destructive to how our brains work.
Absolutely. I mean, I was talking earlier this year on the fact that like I've gotten a Brick, which is like a physical device that blocks social media on my phone for like the majority of the day, because I recognized that I was getting addicted to TikTok and things like that. And I was like, I have limited willpower. And so I'm actually going to physically make it impossible. But I was reading some research and prepping for this that actually showed that, for example, TikTok knows that roughly watching, I think, like 100 videos or something like leads to like compulsive consuming of these videos. TikTok even had an initiative to put like warnings to get people to stop engaging. And that initiative not only was the internal stated objective to get positive PR for that, the objective was not actually to reduce time on platform, because of course that's contrary to their commercial model, but that the effectiveness was that it reduced time on platform, I think, by about 90 seconds per day. You just see that these, like, it's this kind of, libertarianism of like, oh, just manage it. But we know that these platforms are designed to be addictive. And a lot of that was really, really influenced by actually one professor at Stanford who wrote a book, BJ Fogg, named Persuasive Technology. And in many ways, that's actually been the UX design manual that was baked into Silicon Valley. So all of these ideas are being exported. Now, one of the things we talked about prepping for this show is I'm a bit of a skeptic of the social media ban. So something I love about it is I love that our Peace Safety Commissioner is doing something, that there's regulatory innovation, and I think that should be commended. But my big concern is that up to this point, age verification as a technical fix has been shown at this point to be largely ineffective. It does block some under 16s from accessing these platforms. But, the most recent data from Australia shows that like 61% of 12 to 15s still have access to the platforms. In some survey research I saw, 70% say it's not that hard to bypass. So I'm curious for your perspective, given that what I will call the regulatory vision is tracking a bit ahead of the technical capabilities to implement. Like, how do you square that and think about what we should be doing, given that the tech isn't necessarily where we want it to be? And then we'll talk about some of the risks of the way that age verification is being implemented. But yeah, I'm just curious on that. Is we're not dealing with great technology, but we're obviously trying really hard to solve a really important problem.
There's the technology aspect, but there's also the behavioral aspect. So the children that are in that 13 to 16 cohort, they will know a world where they will engage in social media. So that is now part of their behavioral profile, right?
Yep.
So to go, okay, cold turkey ban, that's actually very hard to do at this stage. Understand that there may be effects inside a short period of time as to, how effective it is within the 5-6 months that it launched.
Yeah, I think.
And so, we launched last November. And I just kind of think, how long did it take for when seatbelts became mandatory? Would it have taken for people to put seatbelts in? How long would it have taken? Like, I remember when smoking was phased out in public spaces like restaurants, bars, etc. I remember that people used to smoke inside. And then how long did it take for that to phase out? So it becomes a standard once the age that's coming through has normalized that this is not a thing that they're engaged with.
So we're in a messy transition, and I feel like maybe this is inevitable. The failure is inevitable.
Absolutely. I think that that's the whole point. That's the reason why it's not, I think at the moment it's $49.5 million fee for not effective implementation inside the tech. The tech is scrambling to catch up. So there's a few different points that on this that I kind of always, I've got a multitude of people that always come at me about this. But I honestly feel so strongly that my position is something that's well thought through and has this like level of both technical competency, understanding of what is potentially available at the moment. But then also, how does policy work? And what are our expectations about policy? I would never assume that something would have an 100% effectiveness rate in any policy from day one.
I think that's totally fair.
And I think we're doing a really bad job of being like, what does effective look like at this point in time? And what is it actually going to look like to the 8-year-olds coming through the system now who will not have access and will not have learned access to those tools and systems? Right? Now, they potentially could. But the social impact of those tools and systems available to them, like parents will have more control. Parents will be able to decline the use of these tools. The major issue here is the sense of, am I leaving my child behind by not giving them access to these tools? That was really a legitimate fear of people going, am I creating a child that has no digital capability? Am I making them socially ostracized by not providing them with this tool? And so it is like this kind of rock hard place for parents inside that situation. And this actually gives them an opportunity to align and decline.
You talked about this very libertarian American kind of idea that parents should just teach their kids. I actually think that's insane. Speaking as a non-parent who has parents in my life, they're doing so much, and to expect the average parent to be able to understand the particular risks of any particular flavor of technology and then have the literacy to protect their kids when those companies are making the child safety features really hard to access is insane and unreasonable.
And it's also such a accelerated pipeline that's happening. So I'm in tech. I understand the technology and I can have a level of competency to be able to do it. It changes at the drop of a hat as to what the next technology is, what the semiotics of language are underneath. It's something that for one person to be keeping up all those facets rather than for it to be a community responsibility to ensure that people who are young are protected.
Absolutely. And so I think for me, this gets back to, in my head, there's also the gender analysis of of course, disproportionately mom is going to be doing that labor to keep the kids safe, which again, mental load, look it up. But the thing for me is that online safety, in terms of safe use of technology, we should actually be treating it the way we treat public health problems. And that there is research about, effective interventions for things like encouraging teeth brushing in communities that leads to positive aggregate health outcomes. And so there are actually methods about how to do literacy training around this that I think are really critical. And somewhere like Australia, because we're, more egalitarian minded, I think there is an opportunity to treat it this way, in that, tech and media literacy should be required competencies in schools, but parents should also be provided publicly funded resources to understand how to keep their kids safe online. Now, that said, I think that is sticking your finger in a dam in terms of the solutions, which is where I want to talk about is this idea of safety by design in these platforms, that at the end of the day, we really should be pushing tech platforms to have safety at the center. And I think there is some, I want to call out the regulatory innovations happening in California. So kind of bridging social media to AI, because I think the same problems that we're seeing with social media, we're seeing exacerbated. So, companion AI, we can talk about the eSafety Commission, the new legislation we put there. Governor Newsom in California back in October passed a suite of legislation targeted at this kind of things. For folks who don't know, 32 of the largest 50 AI labs in the world are in California, so it's globally relevant. But also that there's actually an exacerbation of the risk when we move from social media to AIs. Johnny Penn and Ikram Chaudhry talk about moving from the attention to the inattention economy. So all the bad things that are happening are accelerating with AI.
But it's also what informs social media is AI algorithms.
Totally.
So I've had that conversation before in many different facets of when, you're an AI business, why is such a focus on social media? Because the things that we see happening in social media also will affect AI.
Absolutely.
But I did want to just touch on a point there, which was kind of taking it back to the conversation regarding, this idea of community responsibility building.
Yeah.
I feel that we need to we need to have the lens when we're looking at the problem of impact inside Australia. we need to actually put on our big people pants and go, the intention of this isn't 100% compliance. The intention is to create a behavioural norm that then drives greater responsibility globally. Australia is too small a player to have tried to compete with Meta at a legal posturing level to be like, hey, you've got to change your algorithm and do all this stuff because we just don't have the bargaining power. However, once we get more people subscribed to the opinion, that more people can see that it can work. And as I said, my concern is that the discourse around, well, is it effective based on this idea that it needs to be compliance driven rather than, hey, in 5 years' time, let's look at the rates of use, but also let's also look at how the technology has changed with these platforms to try and reduce or change the nature so that they're kind of coming halfway to the conversation. This is a change management piece. It's not going to happen overnight. And a big part of the friction point is that people feel, particularly adults, feel like they're giving over their privacy so that children don't have access to social media. So people are like, well, I don't want to have to upload my license to be able to access platforms.
I'm absolutely setting up to talk about one of the really special interests. But so one of the critiques of this, which I am very much for, organizations like the Mozilla Foundation, Tor, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, have critiqued this from a different lens, which is not about effectiveness, because I see your argument, which is basically harm reductive and agenda setting, in that Australia does not have the bargaining power. Like the $49.5 million fines in USD, that's like 35 million. Like, or it's not the bird sneezes out.
Yeah,
every 5 minutes. But I do see that argument, and I think you're convincing me because I was a skeptic before we sat down. But one of the main critiques from privacy scholars and from these kind of, freedom protecting organizations is that, one, the way that age verification is currently done basically subjects everyone to be required to submit incredibly sensitive personal information like driver's license or passports to verify their own age. The critique, which I am definitely concerned about, is that legislation like this actually hands big tech all of the data that they want for that. But where I think I'm really excited about the work you're doing is the idea that that is the only way to do age verification is actually technically, and a lot of the problem with getting to better options is actually about a coordination problem and a political problem, more so than a technology problem. So can you talk a little bit about what the alternative option is and kind of what the standard of play globally is in implementing those things?
There are these incredibly sophisticated ways to be able to decipher age purely just based on segmentation and behavioral knowledge, right? So there is those elements that organizations sell at a premium to advertisers to target the right age groups based on their behaviors, based on lingatime, all these different kind of factors that come in at that first level. Let's just say that that's it. That exists. I think the thing is that a lot of big companies don't want that to really be evidenced or known in a way that creates the level of surveillance that they actually have on our behaviors.
Yeah, because people are freaked out when they find
out how much you can actually decipher who somebody is and target even for advertising purposes.
I just wanted to point out, and there's a whole literature about this, and we won't go in a rabbit hole. But because of the way that inference works with these kind of large data sets, a particular entity, let's say Meta, doesn't actually have to have any data about you in order to make inferences about you, which may or may not be correct, some of which are silly, like love Spain, doesn't really matter, but there are like catastrophic harms that come from making these inferences in some cases. But so the privacy issues, not only the surveillance, but also with that scale of data that they can, quote, know things about you, even if you in particular have opted out of being surveilled.
The other things that have come into play is systems that are essentially like third-party systems that create you upload your data to here, it then creates a layer in between that basically identifies who you are. But exactly the same issue is occurring, that you have third-party knowledge that has probably your licensing on S3 docket. Like, that's going, this is who you are. Okay, cool. There's a layer of encryption security around that, but ultimately still problematic.
But also a lot of those services also to use them require you to opt into terms and conditions that consent to using your personal ID documents to train their AI, which is then sold for things like biosurveillance to government agencies and things like that. So the business models of those companies that are providing secure identity verification is often one that's still extractive of your personal information. And it's coercive in the sense that if you don't do it, you can't get to the service, but you're taking enormous risks with fraud and other things by doing.
And then also, like, when I looked at from a data sovereignty perspective, that those services mainly reside in Estonia, inside Singapore, our data sitting somewhere else as well. So I can very much empathize with why privacy advocates are like in numbs about why this is the case. I saw a presentation by Professor Ramesh Raspa from MIT, and he was talking about DOOT. It's part of Project Nanda, but essentially what they were really kind of exploring was agentic AI inside government. How can we use and create AI agents inside government? And they were using this use case for DOOT, which was an agent that works inside government systems, particularly in India. Okay. Identify people, but using this zero knowledge framework, right? So how that works. So essentially you have the, let's say Meta at one end. And so it's having to require something to say that your age has been identified and that you're over 16 in the instance of social media. Then on the other end, you have government systems that know who you are,
all your details.
Yeah, all your details, right? But at the moment, the request is for that information to go directly to Meta. What DOOT does is basically uses agentic frameworks to use zero knowledge protocols, sit in between. One direction is saying, basically a token saying yes or no that you're over 16. And then going to Meta, you get a yes or no signal.
Meta at no point has any access to information about you other than this protocol says you've met a particular criteria. And I can imagine there's actually a lot of different criteria that this could apply to.
Absolutely.
And I think there's a really compelling argument. A lot of my clients are worried about privacy legislation compliance and GDPR. Like, this is like such a boon for like all of the DPOs in Europe. We're like, great, don't give me the data if I don't need it.
Yeah.
Have to build all of the costs around protecting this, really.
And I think the thing is that like inside this mechanic, there is structural problems that would need to be addressed technically. So, for example, if it's linked to device and someone has a yes or no, then what stops somebody from taking those tokens and distributing them? Or like there is all these kind of workarounds which someone who's technically proficient would be able to bypass. The other thing is are the architectural systems from the government perspective ample to be able to feed the zero knowledge framework at the centre in India? The reason why that use case was so compelling is because they have Aadhaar. And Aadhaar is not only your kind of person number, like, an identification number, your details, also has like fingerprints and biometric details, iris scans, etc. Australia doesn't have that level of complexity. We have something like MyID, but there is parameters and political will that would be needed to actually create that loop to access. So there's things that need to be considered as part of that application. But it's not that it's impossible. It's just more that it's hard and it requires political will to try and drive it forward. So it's when you kind of look at the structure and how it could work, there is the capability at the moment to drive something that both protects the individual, ensures that their age is verified, that the government doesn't know what websites they're looking at, that the third party doesn't know who they are, and so it's preserving privacy. This like zero knowledge has been around for a long time. It's not something that's new and revolutionary, but how we actually use it embedded inside systems to make digital public infrastructure. I'm using this in the case of age verification because it's very, very kind of niche and something that's obviously saying compelling right now in Australia. But think of the potential applications for like access to the pension, access to like having the systems in place. So when you have a child, that it automatically syncs up because you basically have these agents working on your behalf to create a level of advocacy inside government frameworks.
Yeah, so I think this is really interesting. And speaking as an American and a migrant to Australia, I think, when I landed here and I got kind of like the MyGov ID, which is like Australia's kind of identity verification system that, for me without an Aussie passport, I only get access to 70 government services through it. And I say only kind of facetiously because the US is an absolute identity nightmare. Like I have like a login for every different system that I interact with. And so I think it's important to note that there are countries that are more and less technically set up right now to implement something like, zero knowledge age verification. Whereas, yes, India, the ADMAR system is an example of that. But I think Australia actually, the foundational technology in terms of the idea that the government is actually already holding in a secure, functional way the amount of data that would be required to implement this. And so we're talking about here relatively simple on a global comparative scale, technical layer that needs to be implemented. One thing about this that makes me really excited that answers a critique that we haven't got to yet of age verification requirements is actually that it again plays into big tech's dominance in that building the kind of infrastructure that's required to touch or hold this sensitive data is often completely inaccessible to small players in the market who don't have the SREs and the lawyers and the engineers needed to build those kind of things. And I'm really excited about the potential for something like the zero knowledge verification to actually open up kind of free market competition in terms of making it possible with a standard set of frameworks or libraries that can actually import and invite small players into their own platforms to hook up to this. And so for me, I am not necessarily a free market libertarian on any game, but I think that this could encourage small players to challenge big tech because it reduces the cost load of complying with the regulation. The thing I see as, for our political scientists that's really hard is knowing that, the federal government here is under incredible pressure to encourage or do something in terms of youth safety. It's something like implementing zero trust verification. While folks like us know why it's so valuable, that's actually a really complicated political message to get to the public. And so I think speaking to folks in government, again, the E-Safety Commission is amazing, is that there is a lot of complicated political communications work that would need to be put in place for the federal government to take a position like this and explain it to the public and get the political credit that's necessary to incentivize like this at scale. And I think it's underappreciated that there is a huge element of this that's a political messaging.
100%. It's complex. And these are really hard and curly questions that we need to kind of, and if it was simple, then everyone would do it. But we need to kind of sit with that complexity and go, these are hard problems that we need to overcome. And by actually having the political will to move it, yeah, sure, there's probably applications inside age verification, but this is extending out beyond just like the social media ban. We actually haven't built in a urgency around solving the technical problem. If it was the same level of urgency around protecting our children that there was to solving streamlining tokens inside AI materials, it's just that it hasn't been a priority for tech people to do. And so imagine the same resources that were used for token optimization that were targeted towards age verification and child safety.
I don't want to minimize the technical complexity of dealing with all of this, not only like conceptualizing it as a technical set of possibilities, but then also the complexity of implementing that in a way that is relevant to the national technical infrastructure that exists in any market. But that's why I go back to the fact that the tech exists, but there is political will problems. I'm so excited about what Australia could do because as a smaller country, the number of humans we need to educate and convince something is a good idea. But this is where I think when we talk about like participating in AI and what people can do, those who are good at political messaging or upskill themselves on this and can talk to their neighbors and their aunts and their cousins about the benefits of it. Because when you pitch like zero knowledge age verification, no one cares about that.
Yeah.
But when you can tell people that like, actually, there's engineers who can figure out how to protect our kids and keep your data safe so you're not going to get defrauded. Like, that is a story that is compelling and can be told. But I think right now the messaging around tech and AI is so focused on this like productivity, economic growth, that there isn't a lot of space to have this conversation. And so again, getting on my soapbox, like we could be talking about the goal of AI and technology and national policy is well-being and flourishing. Productivity is a piece of that. But if that were the federal government's message on technology transformation, this would actually fit beautifully politically into that in a way that if you hire the right speechwriters and you get, all of the people involved, you can actually tell a story that could equal a political win for fighting for something that might seem kind of deep tech and irrelevant to the public. Is the national policy agenda defined in a way that allows the people who have the vision and know how to do it? Is there space in the policy conversation for them? And I think the focus on productivity and the focus on GDP growth actually so severely limits the technical possibilities that we have here. And so I'm going to continue to be a critic of that because something like this could be wildly popular.
And just
if the higher level messaging existed in a way that could encompass it.
When we look at the opportunities that this innovation brings, right? A lot of other countries are having the same problem. How do we actually solve this problem to create something that can be used and utilized across other countries that they will adopt? Like, we do such a bad job of actually backing what we can do locally. And we have a level of technical proficiency, world-class research, great technology, sort of researchers inside the space. We are not leveraging that to the best of our abilities because we consistently focus on the same type of problems to solve when we're looking at tech. And so like this, Australia can really carve out AI safety, AI, and, social media, like all these kind of aspects of the responsible agenda, because we are this combination of technically proficient, high sophistication of systems, but also egalitarian mindsets, so that people really want to do things for the greater good, which in other countries is just not possible. And so we can really burgeon a pathway inside that space. Australia is seen as a leader inside this space, and they are looking to us as the guinea pigs to see how this rolls out and how they can leverage it. So we should be like really proud that we're moving inside this space and how we can actually create this level of impact that other people take up and take notice of what's happening inside of space.
When you look at the scale of the companies that Australia produces in technology in particular, we aggressively punch above our weight on the global ecosystem. And part of my analysis is that venture capital here is aggressively constrained compared to in the US. And so the tech companies that are founded here actually have to figure out their unit economics in a way that Australian startups don't, because they get drummed on growth capital. And so what I think that has done is it has built an ecosystem of actually quite globally mature technologists, because you cannot justify your VC funding in the Australian market. And so the density of talent that we have here is truly exceptional for the size of the population we have. But I have a new line of thinking. I have talks coming out about what I call fair go AI. And what I'm kind of rejecting as my deeply apologetic recovering Americanness is that the egalitarianism that exists in this society actually positions us to have a remarkably different approach to AI. The eSafety Commission deserves so much credit for pushing forward this age ban. And so Australia, while we absolutely do not have the ability to force tech to do things, we need either humans who can bridge the gap, which is, I think, something we're trying to participate in. But even if you're someone who is just amazing in one domain, the intellectual humility to recognize that other ways of knowing and other ways of designing are equally valid is also kind of the unlock. Obviously, we are super pro Australia here. Give me my passport next year. But I think if that's it, if you could give like one message to people who actually might be able to do something to get this rolling, like who would you pick and what would you tell them?
It's not a solo problem. It is a social project. So the more people who are actually having these conversations within their community and then advocating with their members of parliament, with their schools, with their fellow parents, the more important, the more it gets prioritized as part of the conversation.
So I love that. I'm going to go in the opposite direction, which is billionaires. I dare you to fund this. Like, because I think like we know that it's
Yes,
like that's but you have enough money. Just fund something for the public good.
you said that
No, not
trickle down economics.
like just give the money away. Like you can have 6 houses. I'll sit for this. No. But I want to put out a challenge, and I don't care what jurisdiction I'm talking to someone who has much more money than they need, because I actually think that like the high net worth individuals that care about technology and know about this can actually do something really important, in that if they just put a bunch of money into this problem in a startup that they believe has the unit economics and the product to make it work, that can create a case that opens up the public discourse, that creates more space for someone like the e-safety commissioner or Elbow to push something in the public.
Can I go who I think should exactly be that person?
Who is it?
Mindaroo Foundation. Foundation that have a specific AI technology arm that at the moment is doing great research, but nothing inside practical now. So I really
yes, that's it. It's all right. Get on us. But I think this goes to the core point, and that someone who is motivated and visionary enough to fund a proof of concept that open up the narrative for political actors who, for very reasonable reasons, are stuck in the bureaucratic inertia of government, can work together. I think I am just so inspired by this idea that, you know, anything that we're trying to do in this space requires multiple stakeholders and requires multiple versions of advocacy. And even if that advocacy comes with like liquidation preferences, at least that thing's getting in the market. Because I am skeptical that the most brilliant folks that we have in government can get it done without some aggressive, cards on the table from the private market to practically ignore. So that's it. I think
that, but it's also a massive market opportunity if it's successful.
Totally. This is one of those issues where I'm like, literally, individual privacy libertarians and hard leftists actually have a beautiful, kind of aggressive center of the Venn diagram.
Yeah.
And so I think if we could just all coordinate and find a sponsor, we could actually get this done. Like, again, there aren't that many people in Australia. If there's anywhere that can prove, like, we have the e-safety commission to do this. We have a population that's small enough that, like, moving the public opinion is actually not that insane. And again, Australia's agenda-setting power on the global stage to innovate regulatorily, to protect people is, I think, somewhat unmatched. So that is my optimism for the day. Is like, I think we can get this done. Everyone call Cara. I think we will figure out how to fund it.
Absolutely. Awesome. Thanks, Aubrey.
Signing off.
Which side are you on? Which side are